definitely. And I want to transition to a topic that might be a little more controversial, and that is, at what point are you allowed to fight back when you are faced with police brutality? Let's say the police, they don't have probable cause to arrest you. It's clear that they're using excessive force. And either you want to fight back, like we saw what happened in Atlanta with the guy who was fighting with the police and he ended up getting shot in the back, or someone you love is being attacked by police without cause. In DC or in other jurisdictions, are you allowed to fight back, and when are you allowed? And I'll just open this up. Kevann, you can start with this, and if each panelist can address this question, that would be great.
Sure. So technically, reading out of the jury instructions, I can just read what it says. It says, if the officer uses more force than appears reasonably necessary, the person stopped may defend against the excessive force, using only the amount of force that appears reasonably necessary for his or her protection. If that person uses more force than is reasonably necessary for protection, he or she acts without justification or excuse. So technically, that's what the law says. If a police officer is using more force than is necessary, you may defend yourself. It's a very tricky situation, though, because again, although that may legally be what you can or cannot do, if you are out on the street and it's at night and you and a police officer are there and you feel like he's using unreasonable force and you want to defend yourself, at the end of the day, if that officer does something that he shouldn't do, if he overreacts, if he does something violent, that officer has a firearm and there's no turning back from that. So even if you were right on the law, that's not gonna, comfort your family if something bad happens to you. So I think there is a legal definition of what you can and cannot do, but for people watching this, especially young people, I would advise you that even if you know the law and know the law correctly, officers don't always follow the law in the way that they should. And I think that protecting yourself is what's most important. So in the vast majority of circumstances, and this is me personally, I think it's an objective opinion, but I think that if you are in a confrontation with a police officer, even if he is using force, you turning around and using force as well. We just kind of saw what happened in Atlanta when a gentleman was shot in his back after running away from the police officers. That's kind of the reality of the situation. So there's a legal definition, and then I think there's kind of the reality that we live in, especially as Black and brown people in this community, that we have to take into consideration. And my advice would be to kind of defer to a police officer, even if he is using, excessive force. And I know that's hard to say, and it's hard for me to even have those words come out of my mouth because it's very uncomfortable for me to say that. But I think kind of protecting yourself and being safe is the most important priority.
Yeah, and same here with me. I agree with you, Kevann. I usually say, swallow your pride if you want to stay alive. And that's what Kevann said. It's extremely important that if a police officer with a taser, with a gun, and maybe maybe you're not armed, or maybe you don't have anything to protect yourself, if they are scared, because most police officers are in fact scared to do their job, especially when they come to certain neighborhoods and communities. When they are scared to do their job and they are armed with a gun, the last thing that you want is a scared police officer having to make a split-second decision about whether or not they have to shoot you or not. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, because if they have to choose between their life and yours, guess who goes first? So I think, if anything, if you are encountering police officers and a police officer is using force, they use any and everything to say that, you're resisting. And I think that if you stay as still as possible during the entire arrest, it's very difficult for the police officer to then mishandle you. Because then when we're coming to court, what ends up happening is now we have to decide what's reasonable and what's not reasonable. Is the force used against a man the same kind of force that can be used against a pregnant woman? And so there's so many circumstances that can occur. You don't want to be the person at the cusp of the definition of reasonable to your detriment. So that's just my recommendation.
Nice. Yeah, and a related question to that, there's this concept of qualified immunity that police have regarding police encounters, such as the ones that we just talked about when you're trying to defend yourself, or if you want to bring a civil claim in court. can you all elaborate on what qualified immunity is, your thoughts about it, and how it works from a practical standpoint? And Heather, if you could address this question.
So qualified immunity basically protects the police, right? It gives them the opportunity to not be sued for the actions that they take against someone, the idea being that it is in their line of duty and they are protected from that particular action. There's a new case that I believe came out this week. I want to say it might have been Virginia. I'm blanking on the state, where the language used by the court was unbelievably perfect, right? They basically said, this has to stop. The case for them definitely dealt with someone that had a run-in with the police, but at one point the gentleman is on the ground and they continue to assault him and I believe eventually kill him. And his family was seeking to sue these officers and seek justice. And the court indicated that at some point we have reached this point in our country where we cannot keep allowing these actions to occur to Black and brown people and there being no consequences. And so it removed the qualified immunity for these particular officers, which will give the family the ability to sue. Now, of course, they have to go through a trial. But I think it's such a good point about where we are. It was one thing before, I think, when a few people thought there were just a few little cases all over. Well, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, the gentleman this week from Georgia have taught us this is not an isolated incident. And in fact, the Washington Post talked this week about how DC harassment of Black and brown people is at a huge and high rate and has not stopped because of video cameras, body worns, or any of that. So the consequences mean that the police officers who do those actions need to be handled or dealt with, and there need to be consequences. And the qualified immunity would give that ability.
Nice. And related to that qualified immunity question, what are your thoughts, or the panelists, any panelist who wants to answer this question, what are your thoughts about the best way to hold police accountable, whether it's the court system or the legislature? In your opinion, what's the best way to hold police accountable?
Well, I definitely think, as Heather was saying, qualified immunity is extremely problematic because these police officers are not held accountable for their actions. If there's a civil suit because a police officer does something wrong, it's not that officer that would have to pay anything. It's not the police department. It's you and I. It's the citizens of Washington, D.C. So if a police officer uses excessive force or engages in any other type of police misconduct and that individual then sues the city, it's us that pays for it. So qualified immunity, it's really problematic for that reason. If something happens and you do feel like you need to have some type of recourse for something a police officer does to you that he should not. First, there's the criminal case you'll most likely have to deal with, because if there's any type of physical altercation and he physically assaults you, you're going to be charged with assaulting a police officer. That's kind of just the way it works whenever there's something physical between you and the officer. So the criminal case is what you'd have to deal with first. Recourse, though, I think that getting a civil attorney and actually suing for that is one way to attack the problem financially. I think it's also important to document these instances of misconducts with police officers. You can file a complaint with the Office of Police Complaints. You also want to file a complaint with the Metropolitan Police Department. And those things are important because at least there will be some type of documentation that memorializes this officer's misconduct. And it's important for the next person that may engage in an interaction with this officer because there's some type of documented history of how he reacted in the past. So I do think that the Office of Police Complaints, you want to file a complaint with MPD, and filing a civil suit are all ways that you can try to, some forms of recourse for an action like that happens.
Definitely. And Kevann, a follow-up question to that. These OPM complaints, are they coming out in court? There's been a lot of, there's been a lot of criticism in different jurisdictions about police not having to disclose this information, the public not having access to this information. Are defense attorneys able to use that against police in court?
Rarely, or sometimes, I should say. First, I think the bigger problem that you just touched on is that the general public is not privy to this information at all. A police officer can engage in police misconduct. There can be an investigation, sustained findings in which he actually did those things that he's accused of, and then the public has no idea, and it's not disclosed to the public in any way. As for whether we can use it in court, it a lot of times depends on the forum that you're in. We always ask judges to make the prosecutors give us all of the former police misconduct that any officer involved in our case has. The court that we're in front of makes a decision of whether they think that all of it is relevant for all of the police officers, whether it's only relevant for certain officers that were more involved, and whether out of all of the complaints that they have, which complaints actually pertain to this case. Oftentimes when we do get information, what we get is called the PPMS summary. And instead of the entire investigation and kind of understanding what happened, we get a short summary of what those facts are. And that's only if the complaint was sustained. And in that case, we have to go back in front of the judge, and we then have to ask if we ask for the source documents, because we say this summary does not really tell us what this officer actually did or what actually happened. And then that's another battle that we have to have with the government to get those documents. And then by the time you do get whatever documents the judge allows you to receive, you have to get, again, permission from the judge to use those documents and show the judge that it's relevant for whatever case that you have. So by the time you reach the time when an officer is actually testifying in trial, you can sometimes have some of that material to use against him to show bias that he may have, to show past misconduct. But it's a lot of times whittled down from the vast the vast amount of police misconduct that exists. What you're able to use at trial is always less than that, and many times significantly less than that. So the jury never really gets to hear a lot of times all of the things that those officers may have done, or all of the misconduct, or even the details of the misconduct. A lot of times it's just kind of a general synopsis that the judge will let you get into, but not kind of the meat of the problem or a detailed explanation as to what happened. So the short answer is most often, not really. You get to use it sometimes, but a lot of it is hidden even from the jury in court when that officer is testifying, and it's 100% hidden from the public at large, who certainly have a vested interest in knowing which officers have engaged in this type of misconduct. Those officers are still walking the street as active police officers today, and the public simply doesn't know the type of misconduct or unlawful activity they've participated in the past.
Nice, nice.